What's up, guys? Excuse me, that's a great way to start the video. I'm not gonna edit it out though, we're gonna leave it in. So I have got an exciting three-parter for you today. Exciting if you like muscles and drawings from me. But if you're looking for someone else that is gonna point at their shredded hamstrings and scream at you and use that as evidence for why it is good ways to train your hamstrings, then this might not be exciting. Maybe go find that channel because I'm not that guy. Maybe I'll take my pants off though later on if you stick around and I'll show you my hamstrings. Or maybe that'll be for a different video on a different page, in a different location. I've already gotten sidetracked. So before I tell you all the awesomeness we've got coming up, don't forget to do that YouTube thing that some of y'all are doing a great job at doing. Like, subscribe, leave me some comments down below. Get down there, talk about stuff. Feelings, muscles, I don't know, what else you guys want to talk about? Say something about politics down there, and then we'll get a thread of like 8,000 comments. And hey, if it's good for the algorithm, have at it. Get in there, have some fun. But so today I'm going to do a three-parter. You will see them released one at a time. So this is part one, in case you haven't figured out. The first one is part one. Part two will be tomorrow. Part three will be the day after. And what I want to discuss is some of the most common questions I get with hamstring training. So originally I had one specific question I've had asked a couple times. I've had people ask me about positioning specifically in a seated leg curl, specifically, even double specifically, about what leaning forward in a seated leg curl does. Should you do that? Should you not do that? Spoiler, you're gonna have to stick around for the answer. I was gonna answer that and say, hey, here's this one thing, do this position, here's these things to be aware of. But I thought I would give you guys a better answer. And I think every better answer starts with a little bit better understanding of what we're talking about, a little bit better understanding of hamstring anatomy, hamstring physiology, and done in the way that I like to do best with my sweet drawings. This one I'm just gonna draw as we go, so hopefully I won't leave anything out. But again, I don't want things getting too fancy. And I always say, I draw these as well too, aside from the fact that I think my drawings are beautiful. I know some of you disagree, but you're wrong. And you're entitled to your opinion, even your wrong ones. My drawings are beautiful because my mom told me so. But I like to do drawings because I think they actually convey things you should know for the gym, right? I mean, obviously, if you're a nerd and you want to impress your fellow nerds in the nerdery, it's cool to know every actually bone surface, every exact attachment point, origin, insertion, all that kind of stuff, knowing the complicated names. Like I said, that's cool for impressing nerds. That's cool if you're an orthopedic surgeon. I think if somebody, detaches their hamstring, it's probably a good idea to know where to reattach it specifically. But as far as you and even myself, for making gym decisions, I like the drawings because I think they help people see them better in a kind of simplified context, right? And what do you really need to know about hamstring? Same as anything, where does it exist? It attaches for simplicity purposes. Let's forget about fascia planes for a little bit. There's an origin and an insertion. So it attaches at 2 points. And basically you can just create tension between those 2 points. Sometimes that tension is a controlled eccentric. Sometimes that tension is a concentric. Sometimes that tension just keeps things still, doesn't actually change length. But it creates tension from point to point, and then most of the time, there's some weird stuff in the body, but most of the time crosses over joints and influences those joints. And I use the word influence because I think that most accurately indicates what they do. Because like I said, it doesn't always just move joints. Sometimes they influence the joint by keeping it from moving. So anyway, on to some hamstring stuff. Black is for bones, B and B. So I would say red is for muscles, but that doesn't work. But your muscles are full of blood, so that's why it's red. Keep it really scientific around here. So this is your pelvis. It is shaped like a bowl. This is gonna be your femur. So again, sitting in the side of your pelvis. Let's make this a nice circle for the joint. And then here is your knee. We'll do this. We'll make these look really weird. So here is your knee. Maybe I'll make them look less weird in the future. But so for anybody, if you just tuned in right now, go back like 30 seconds. I don't know why you would. But this is your pelvis. This is your femur. This is your lower leg, 2 bones obviously. But we're just, for simplicity purposes, again, we've got where the hamstring attaches and basically the joints that it crosses over. Now again, there's different heads of the hamstring. I understand that. But for simplicity purposes, obviously we're going to say, well, what does the hamstring do? What joints does it cross over? And really what happens? How do you change its length? Because people honestly still get kind of confused about this stuff. So again, for simplicity purposes, your hamstring attaches at the bottom of your pelvis pretty much. And so one, because it crosses from the pelvis over to the femur, it will influence what is occurring at your hip joint. So again, it's going to influence hip flexion, hip extension, and really just even creating sometimes stability or immobility around that joint. It crosses down over here and attaches below the knee joint. So it attaches to the lower leg. And so that's important. If you're impressing, again, the nerds in the nerdery, write this one down. It is a biarticular muscle. So it crosses over two articulations or two joints, and therefore can influence both the joints. So what do we want to know? What happens as far as ways that we can change length of this? So let's talk about the pelvis first. This is one that's going to be slightly ugly for erasing and re-erasing, but bear with me. So anytime this joint moves, so if we're talking here for simplicity purposes, just looking in this plane, yes, in other planes it changes as well too, but it's mostly influenced by hip flexion and hip extension. And so realize that is your femur moving in the pelvis, or if your femur is fixed, the pelvis moving basically around the femur. And what I mean by that is, so let's say first we do, if this is a person standing, imagine we've got a foot down here, but I'm too lazy to draw it. We want to do someone doing an RDL. So if you could see me from the side, this is me at the top of an RDL. What happens as you hip flex to do an RDL? Your pelvis basically tilts. So for the most part, your femur kind of moves back and forward a little bit in space, but for the most part, your pelvis tilts forward. So depending on the range of motion, man, that's horrible. Even I can't live with that. Let's try again. So here's the bowl again. So I want to at least try and keep some uniformity with the bowl shape. This is the top of the bowl. So the bowl went from the top of it being up here to tilting forward. So again, people like the analogy of like a bowl of water. So if we were tipping the bowl this way, that's what we just did. And so hopefully you can see if the attachment point of the hamstring was down here somewhere, and then we tip this whole bowl up, basically you can hopefully see how now that attachment point is higher. So if everything else was staying still, it basically moved from when the bottom of the bowl was here to now we've tipped up and the bottom of the bowl is here. So that is a lengthened hamstring, right? And so again, hopefully you guys can see that as that point moved and this point didn't, that is it getting longer. So we're gonna go to the point, and most of the time, there's a couple things it could be. When someone runs out of range of motion, you know, when they're doing hip flexion, when they're doing an RDL, basically it's because they run out of hamstring length. Potentially, there's stuff on the other side of the joint as well too, but for the most part, this is gonna be a lengthened ham. Now, what's the opposite thing that can happen here? So again, I said it could be, when we're talking about the hip joint, it could be the pelvis moving and the femur staying still like we just did. But what's the other thing that could happen? We could have hip flexion occur by the pelvis staying still and the femur moving. So again, if I'm standing right here and I go ahead and I do straight leg hip flexion and I raise my leg up and go in this position. So again, we've got this, assuming the knee angle doesn't change, so the knee is still fully extended. Now just imagine, obviously, we've got that same contact point down here, kind of wraps around some stuff down here, so there's tissue and deep stuff or whatever, but basically it kind of does make a turn. It's not going to stay perfectly like a straight line, so this is a little bit of a silly drawing, but kind of accurate. Hopefully you guys can see as we've moved around here and this repositions around here, this is another way of it lengthening basically from the opposite motion. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. As now this point didn't move, but this point moved more this way and the hamstring lengthened this way. Now hopefully again, all you can see is we're just basically changing things relative. So if I just took this whole drawing and turned it on its side, it would basically be the exact same thing as an RDL. So I just wanted to show how you can have two different types of looking things happen and how that can basically have two different effects or two different ways to both lengthen the hamstring as far as the hip is concerned. Now we're gonna look at the knee joint. So we've got the knee joint. So again, it should be noted that again, as you get more into hip flexion, the hamstring lengthens, and there is a point of hip extension when you're fully hip extended. All other things being same, the hamstring will be shorter relative to more hip flexion. I'll clarify that in a minute. But the other thing the hamstring obviously does is, one, it affects the pelvis. Other muscles can do that as well too. Of course, one, it affects the pelvis relative to the femur, it affects the hip joint, but it also affects the knee. So we could do this as well too. So now we've got the hamstring, and obviously if let me do this first just to go over this one more time and not change things. So we've got the knee extended, we've got the hamstring going here. This is the point in space right there, so that is when the knee is extended. Let's leave that same point in space just to try and make that a little bit more clear. So we'll leave that dot down there. So that's where it was attached. But now we move the knee into knee flexion, and now that hamstring is going to be attached, not a perfect drawing, but somewhere over here. So hopefully you can see that length change there, right? So as we go into knee flexion, obviously this point of attachment moving in space from here to here, the hamstring has shortened and it has pulled that lower leg up into place. And so both joints are affected, both joints affect hamstring length, and the positioning of the other one affects it as well too. So again, this is a position right now where I'll kind of clarify this with some exercises in about 2 minutes. is so when we have basically your hip fully extended, so remember, hip flexed, more lengthened hamstring, hip extended is going to be a more contracted hamstring. When we have the hip extended, like in this position, and the knee flexed, that's going to be a fully shortened or fully contracted hamstring. Does that make sense? So again, if we want to have something happen, like I said before, where if you don't have both of those things happening, it's not going to be a fully shortened hamstring, if that makes sense. So again, I could have full knee flexion, but without full hip extension, the hamstring's not going to be short, and vice versa. So what I mean by that is, I could have, like would be happening in a seated leg curl, I could have hip flexed, so all other things, that means the hamstring is going to be a little bit longer, and also have knee flexed. So I've got the knee flex. So this is, hopefully you can kind of see if I'm in a seated leg curl and I flex here, this is kind of what's happening. Basically the hamstring, again, the joints don't work separate, but for understanding what I'm saying, the hamstring is lengthened across the hip, but shortened across the knee. So when you're doing this is why I say sometimes, what's the difference of why would I have a seated leg curl? Why would I have a lying leg curl? Well, in a seated leg curl, because you're hip flexed, you can never fully shorten the hamstring, but you can fully lengthen it. So again, now getting into some exercises, hopefully that makes sense. So again, we already did the RDL, so I'll show that again, but so hopefully an RDL makes sense because you're extended at the knee, which again, if you're more extended relative to more flex, all other things being the same, the hamstring is lengthened. So extended at the knee and flex at the hip will equate to a fully lengthened hamstring. So if I'm in a seated leg curl, it does the exact same thing. So I said this before, here's me seated in a seated leg curl. Here's me having both of those things happen at the same time, hip fully flexed, knee fully extended, and it is a fully lengthened hamstring. So that's why seated leg curls are a great option for loading a fully lengthened hamstring, and RDLs are. So what's the benefit of a lying leg curl? I kind of actually showed this position already, but just so we can see it in a different way. So here's me laying down on a machine. Here's the lying leg curl. Again, you guys get what you pay for. Shut up about the drawings, I don't care. And as you go from here, so this is why I always say in a lying leg curl, you can't fully lengthen the hamstring, because obviously as the pad's here, obviously normally let's say the pad actually ends here, obviously somewhere with your knee joint hanging off the edge. So if the pad ends here, you're lying down on it. Your body is up here. You got some torso up here. Weirdest body ever. But so again, what do we have to have a fully lengthened hamstring? You have to have hip flexion. So because you can't hip flex, because you're locked into hip extension, you'll never be able to get a fully lengthened hamstring here. But as this knee pulls up, knee flexes, this is a combination of the thing again for a fully shortened hamstring. So we've got, what do we need for a fully shortened hamstring? We've got hip extended and we've got knee flexed. Those points are as close together as they're going to get, and that's a fully shortened, fully contracted hamstring. So I just wanted to run through some of that stuff real quick. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'm going to answer some questions next on what we see in various exercises. But hopefully you can obviously see in various different orientations, depending on if I just tip this drawing in space. Now this looks like a lying leg curl, where I actually demonstrated the exact same thing from the other position already. So again, if I turn this entirely on its side, people always ask me sometimes, hopefully some things are clicking for you, like what's the difference between a lying leg curl and like a kneeling leg curl? You could actually be in the exact same hip position. People do basically the standing ones, like iCarry makes one, where you do this leg curl on the machine standing up. Most people like that machine because they've seen Kai Green use it and his hamstrings look great. What is that standing leg curl? Well, basically it's a lying leg curl turned on its side, and you can only do one at a time. And you also don't have your own weight pressing you down into the pad. So personally, I don't think that machine's particularly useful, because why would you want a lying leg curl where the only option is you can do one leg at a time? I would just prefer having a lying leg curl where I have the option. I can do both legs or I can do one leg, and I also have my entire weight locking my torso and my pelvis in place. So most of the time when people do that iCarry machine or any kind of standing single leg hamstring, you really kind of got to pull in tight. The load that you're going to use is going to be probably less than you could on a lying leg curl. Not saying it's bad, but comparatively to a lying leg curl, I don't see the point. I'll pretty much leave it at that. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an idea, again, of basic hamstring anatomy, a little bit better understanding of the two joints it crosses over, the hip joint, the knee joint, and basically how moving those can influence what is occurring with the muscle, and basically how both of them moving can change lots of stuff. So again, hopefully that's an understanding that basically as we go from here, this is a fully shortened hamstring, fully hip extended, knee flexed. And then all the way the other opposite direction, you need full hip extension and full hip flexion and full knee extension to fully lengthen the hamstring. So that is your hamstring anatomy and physiology 101. And again, the whole main take home point of this is hopefully that helps you see some things better, see some exercises better. Because I always say is while there are already great exercises that have been made or created, what your body does is what your body does. So it's good if you can just get this idea of the sweet drawing I did and say, this is my body, these are the joints involved, these are the bones involved, this is what the muscle does. And everything else is like exercises are just made or created around that. So again, hopefully, again, I went through it, but if you said, okay, well, what's this machine? What's that machine? What happens when here? Well, if you kind of go back to this thing and go through those checkpoints of obviously, okay, well, hip, flexion, all things being the same, is a lengthened hamstring. Hip extension is a shortened hamstring. Knee flexion is a shortened hamstring. Knee extension is a lengthened hamstring, and put together all the pieces. Then you aren't stuck in thinking, here's the exercise I have to do for hamstring. You know what your hamstring does, and then can better observe what exercises do from that point. And again, hopefully there, I don't like to ever say for sure definitively an exercise is good and exercise is bad. I'd rather just give you the tools to actually have a better idea of what is going on within that exercise. And then maybe I'll take my pants off later and point at my hamstring when I do it and scream as well, because that also helps get the point home. So that is part one. Part two, I'm going to answer the question I get often of, I get the question about leg presses, I get the question about squats most commonly, are those good hamstring exercises? So I'm going to go through some anatomy on those and hopefully better answer that question. Come back for part two tomorrow, or depending on when you're watching it, go watch it now.